Ja, ein ganz herzliches
Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Ganter. I'm with the Global Policy Forum Europe in charge of international tax justice, and I am very happy to see so many of you here and to be your moderator this evening. Welcome to everybody who is here. Welcome to everybody who's joining us online. Before I hand over the floor to Sabine Fandrich, Managing Director of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, a few housekeeping remarks. We have interpreters with us, simultaneous interpretation, German into English and English into German. If you would like to comment this event on social media, please use our hashtags FES Erbschaftssteuer, ideally, or FES Tax the Rich. And afterwards, we will have a short reception. There will be refreshments. And of course, you can also purchase Gabriel Zuckmann's books. There will also be the possibility to have your books signed. Today, we will talk about his newest book, It's Time to Tax the Billionaires, and we'll hear more about that later. Sabine, you have the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you most cordially on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Welcome to all of you who are here, and welcome to all of you who join us online. Before we start, let us remember that today we are commemorating the Holocaust Memorial Day. And let us remember that this is also an obligation to us to fight right-wing extremism, to fight ideologies of injustice and inequality. Our Mitte-Studie, the study on the political opinions of people in Germany, has surprised us once again. 7% of people who were asked agree or tend to agree that there is life that is worth keeping and life that isn't. And 14% say undecided. 15% fully agree to the statement that we should have a leader who will lead Germany with a strong hand. These are ideologies that we need to fight against, not just today, but every day. And I would like to invite all of you to join us in this fight. Now, today we're talking about a different subject. You already saw the wonderful title and the beautiful boat. We're going to talk about the question or the issues of wealth, power, fair taxation in a time of growing inequality. The title, It's Time to Tax the Billionaires, is also a political statement. We live in one of the richest countries of the world, and at the same time, we live in an era of enormous economic concentration. Never before in recent history have there been so many super rich or ultra rich or billionaires. 1 billion, that's 1,000 million euros. The super rich have never owned as great a share in public wealth as today, at a time where sales staff, where craftspeople, blue-collar workers are under pressure. A lot of people are struggling with rent payments or with precarious jobs. And these are not unrelated developments. These developments are interlinked because the concentration of wealth has increased in recent years. Now, why is this, and what can we do about this? We'll hear more about this later. We have a tax system that puts a greater burden on labor than on wealth in a so-called performance economy. This is not a side effect. It's not a marginal effect. This is dangerous for social cohesion and democracy in general. It erodes trust in democracy. So it's not a marginal issue. And it's certainly not a question of envy or jealousy. It's a question of justice and of democracy. And we're going to talk about it today. It concerns all of us because it concerns public budgets, social security systems, infrastructure, educational opportunities, which is the backbone of our economy. The debate on a higher taxation of billionaires is often led with emotional undertones. Strong images, there's a lot of moralizing. You also hear a lot of fear-mongering concerning the economic effects that this might have. But you also hear that people hope for more justice brought about by fairer taxation. And this is where our keynote speaker today comes in, Gabriel Zucman, whom I would like to welcome most cordially. Gabriel Zucman is one of the most influential economists of his generation. He's been doing research on wealth inequality, tax avoidance, tax flight, tax evasion, etc. And he has shown that this is not a marginal phenomenon. He has been able to demonstrate and to show how much money governments and public budgets lose because of these phenomena. And he has been able to bring the question of fair taxation back into the public discourse. And now, of course, a bit of advertising for our work as well. Gabriel Zucman was awarded the Hans Matthöfer Award for economic writing of the Hans and Traute Matthöfer Foundation within the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, together with his co-author Emanuel Sais for the book The Triumph of Injustice. This award, the Hans Matthöfer Award, is presented each year for economists who think beyond the macroeconomic mainstream. This year, the ceremony will be on the 21st of April, and of course, all of you are cordially invited. Gabriel Zucman, thank you very much for coming here to present your new book and to have this debate with us and with your fellow panelists, whom I would also like to welcome most cordially. You've all been to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung before. Julia Friedrichs, who's a journalist, author, and filmmaker, and who's been working on this issue for a long time already. Julia Jiermann, who is in charge of tax law and tax policy at the Tax Justice Network, and Tim Klusendorf, who is a member of the German Parliament and Secretary General of the SPD. Thank you that you are here. And welcome. Sarah Ganter from the Global Policy Forum Europe will be our moderator this evening. Thank you very much for the great cooperation. Thank you also to Suhrkamp Verlag and the German Trade Union Federation. I think this is a great collaboration, and you also see how many people are here. So great job, everybody. Now, first of all, I would like to hand over the floor to Stefan Kürzel, who is a member of the managing board of the German Trade Union Confederation, and he will shed some light on the issue from a trade union perspective. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would also like to welcome you most cordially to this interesting panel discussion. In Germany, we have up to 200 billionaires. Oxfam published the newest figures the week before last. And if you adjust it for inflation, in 2025, their wealth increased by 30% to up to 840 billion euros. 30% in a year. Well, maybe we're doing something wrong as trade unions, because maybe our demands should also look a little different. Because 30%, imagine that is a lot of money for workers as well. And we're also discussing public spending, the investment program, the DGB and the IMK. We asked for 600 billion euros for 10 years. Now it's 500 million for 12 years. These are important investments that are needed, but of course they have to be financed via debt. Then, of course, defense spending, 75 billion euros. We have special assets for climate protection, 37 billion euros. And at the same time, the municipalities are encountering their limits. They have a huge deficits. So we have great wealth on the one hand and deficits on the other hand. We could also say poverty. In the municipalities, what's happening is the worst that can happen in a democracy, because that is where people see what the government does for them or doesn't do for them. And a lot of people are complaining. It's winter, it used to be normal, but streets aren't cleaned, and roads are not cleared of snow and ice. That is something that people see. It used to be cold in past winters as well, but this is new. So these inequalities need to be addressed and remedied so that social cohesion can increase again in our societies. And I would like to say that quite clearly. I would also like to say that there's a huge debate going on here in Germany. All workers apparently are excessively lazy in Germany compared to others. Everything is called into question. Working times, sick days. It's about co-payments to the statutory health insurance funds, to long-term care, etc. I think we need to turn the debate around. We need to point out that we are a social welfare state, and a welfare state can only work if everybody contributes according to their abilities. That means pay taxes. Sabine alluded to it briefly. Of course, there are a lot of emotions in this debate. Süddeutsche Zeitung from 27th of October wrote that family entrepreneurs call any taxes indecent, and they keep lamenting that it's the ruin of the economy. The gloves have come off. They conjure up images that are absolutely not okay. They're talking about plundering graves or corpses. We don't want to do this. That's not what we're doing. That's not what we have in mind. The welfare minister of Hesse, Jürgen Borchert, said, wealth is like manure. If you have too much of it, it smells bad. And if you spread it out evenly, it's good for everybody. I think this should be our motto. If you put dung to good use, then it can really do a lot of good things. Rich families too want good schools. Entrepreneurs want a good educational system, want good roads and waterways, etc., so that they can do business. But we need to make sure to have enough money to pay for childcare, education, infrastructure, etc. We already had a discussion with Gabriel Zuckman this afternoon, and it was really inspiring. I can tell you that you will hear a very interesting presentation, and I also look forward to a fascinating debate. So have a good evening, everybody, and here's to a fascinating discussion.
Man hört mich noch nicht jetzt. Dann habe ich jetzt die.
I think now you can hear me great. Now it's a great honor to introduce the special guest tonight. Sabine introduced him already. His proposals attracted a lot of attention in France and in other parts of the world as well. I think he was called the new rock star economist. Politico recently counted him amongst the 15 most influential persons in Europe. Gabriel, the floor is yours. Please share your ideas with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here tonight. I've come here to tell you about an anomaly which is undermining our democracies, but an anomaly that has a practical solution. This is what I've tried to explain in my book, Reichensteuer, and this is what I'd like everybody here tonight to understand. So what is this anomaly? This anomaly is the fact that the super rich, the wealthiest people in our society, think billionaires, pay much less tax relative to their income than the working class, the middle class, all other social groups. And we suspected, some of us, that this might be the case, but it's only recently that it has actually been established with studies, with facts. And the reason why we couldn't know it for sure until relatively recently is because there is a great deal of opacity about the wealth of the super rich in our societies. We have, generally speaking, here in Germany or in France, excellent government economic statistics, but they have one blind spot, which is that they are silent about the wealth of the super rich, the income that they earn, and the taxes that they pay. Now, this opacity has started to dissipate over the last 4 or 5 years, thanks to the pioneering work of a number of economists working in different countries in partnership with tax administration to establish the facts. And once this work was done, it has been a shock for the scientific community, because we've realized that there is a major problem today in our tax systems, which is that the super rich barely pay any income tax. The income tax, the personal income tax, is normally the pillar of tax progressivity. It's how the rich are supposed to contribute to our common revenue needs. The working class, the middle class pays a lot in consumption taxes, in VAT, sometimes in property taxes. The very rich pay very little in consumption tax and in such levies, because for them, consumption is just not very big. Most of their income is saved. But in principle, the income tax is how they're supposed to contribute. Now, a few years ago, like 3-4 years ago, there were revelations by the US media ProPublica on the income tax payments of American billionaires. And you saw in some years people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, declaring very little income, paying very little in income tax. In 1 year, Jeff Bezos said, look, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim family benefits. And he received family benefits. That's incredible. And there's nothing illegal in that, and I want to be very clear. It's how the system works. It's how the law is written. If you find ways to report very little income, as CEO of Amazon, he didn't pay himself any wage, Amazon didn't distribute any dividend, and so on, then you don't have to pay income tax. What the recent studies that I try to summarize in the book have established is that the problem goes beyond just a few isolated cases. It is a systemic issue. It's a problem in the US, it's a problem in France, it's a problem in Brazil, it's a problem in all the countries for which high-quality studies have been conducted, and I have zero doubt that this is also a problem in Germany. We understand why. It's because when you're extremely rich, it's easy to structure your wealth such that this wealth will generate no or very little taxable income. And the consequence of this is that all taxes included, billionaires pay about half as much in tax relative to their true ability to pay their economic income as other social groups. In France, for instance, the average French person pays 50% in tax, all taxes included, meaning out of any euro earned, about 50 cents on average go to the government. But for billionaires, out of any euro earned, only 25 cents go to the government. So why is that a problem? It's a problem, number one, because it's a basic violation of one of our most fundamental principles in our democracies, which is the principle of equality before the law. And in particular, the most conservative interpretation that you can make of the principle of equality before the tax law is that the rich shouldn't be able to pay less relative to their income than the rest of the population. But this is precisely the situation we're in today, and this is in and of itself a grave problem. Now, it turns out that this is also a problem because it has important revenue implications for the governments. The wealth of the super-rich has exploded, and it means that if they paid their fair share of tax, they would contribute sizable amounts of revenue for the government. So these are taxes that the rest of the population wouldn't have to pay, or these are revenues that could be spent for infrastructure, for education, for healthcare, and so on. So the revenue, the government revenue stakes of the problem of the very weak, or in fact non-taxation of billionaires, could be ignored perhaps 40 years ago when the wealth of global billionaires was the equivalent of 3% of world GDP. But today, the wealth of global billionaires is the equivalent of 15% of world GDP. We can't ignore the problem anymore. And number three, and most importantly, it's an issue because it fuels the rise of wealth concentration. If the super-rich can accumulate wealth tax-free, it has a snowballing effect on the concentration of wealth. Ordinary people, before they can save any money, they have to pay tax, they have to pay income tax. And with whatever remains, they can save, they can accumulate a bit more wealth. The super-rich can essentially save 100% of their income, no tax or very little tax owed. And so this is one of the main reasons why their wealth has been growing so fast over the last decades, about 10% per year on average over the last 4 decades. And why is that a problem? Well, for most people, wealth is a good thing, right? It's safety for your old days. It's security in case you face shocks, for instance, unemployment. But for the very rich, obviously, they don't save for retirement. That's not the reason why one would accumulate billions of euros, right? Wealth for the super rich is power. And an extreme concentration of wealth always means an extreme concentration of power. The power to influence politics, the power to influence electoral processes, the power to influence the prevailing ideology by buying newspapers or media, the power to influence markets by buying competitors. And so there has always been a fundamental tension in democratic societies between extreme wealth on the one hand and the very possibility of democracy on the other hand. And so that's the main reason why we should all care about this spiral, this snowballing effect that I mentioned. Now, the most important thing to understand is that all of these problems are not like laws of nature, and there is in this great battle between oligarchy and democracy, which I think is going to be the great battle of the 21st century, there are many reasons to be optimistic about the chances that democratic forces will prevail. And in the book, I've tried to make one very modest proposal to fix this anomaly that I've mentioned, which is simple. It's about creating a new principle in our laws, in our tax laws, establishing the principle that extreme wealth has to come with uncompressible duties towards society. Meaning, if you're extremely wealthy, I proposed 100 million euros as the threshold, you have to pay a minimum amount of tax each and every year. Whatever your merits, whatever your individual circumstances, whatever the nature of your wealth, we don't want to know. If you're super rich, you have to pay a minimum amount of tax each and every year. And if we want this minimum to be effective, it has to be expressed not as a fraction of income. Ask Jeff Bezos to pay a minimum income tax. 20% of zero is still zero. That's pointless. It has to be expressed as a fraction of wealth. Hence the proposal for a minimum tax for the super rich equal to 2% of their wealth. The French National Assembly in February 2025 passed that legislation, passed a bill that would do that, the first time ever in the world that such a proposal was discussed and adopted by a parliamentary chamber. The French Senate then blocked this, and so it's not yet enacted into law, but we've seen in France, and we are seeing everywhere in the world, that there is tremendous popular democratic support for this idea. We're talking about 86% of French voters who support this measure. Across all political stripes, left, right, 86%. And in polls that have been conducted everywhere, it's similar numbers. That is what is making me fundamentally optimistic about the fact that this will end up being implemented. It's very difficult to know whether it's going to be a matter of months, a matter of years, but the status quo is impossible to defend. The solution exists, it is clear, everybody understands, 2% minimum for the super rich, those who have more than 100 million. It's an idea whose time has come. I don't know if France will be the first one to enact it, or perhaps the state of California, which will have a referendum in November, perhaps on a 5% billionaire tax. Or it could be Germany. Perhaps it will be Germany, or it could be the UK or Belgium, and we see the debate bubbling up all over the world. But fundamentally, I have little doubt that we'll see something like that happen. I don't think we can afford to wait for a very long time, to be honest. I think there is a high risk with inaction, and we should try to mobilize to make this happen sooner rather than later. So thank you so much for having me, and I very much look forward to the discussion and to your questions. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Gabriel. Please have a seat. I'm going to speak in German, so you need the headphones. So, sehr schön.
Gabriel, if you can hear me, asks the moderator, please give me a sign. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Gabriel. So, in Germany, people are also gladly discussing wealth tax. It's not really a wealth tax in the old sense, or in the old German sense. You said don't call it that. What's different? What distinguishes the tax that you propose from the wealth taxes as we know them?
There is a long tradition of wealth taxation in Europe. Germany used to have a wealth tax, France, Sweden, Denmark, many countries. And it's important to understand, and this is something I try to explain in the book, that those wealth taxes didn't work very well. Of course, conservative people are going to use that argument to then say, we've tried wealth taxation, it didn't work super well for reasons that I'm going to explain, hence it will never work, forget about it. But the way that we've tried to think about the historical experience is different, is to try to learn from the mistakes that were made and try to see if solutions exist, and solutions do exist, and then propose something that would actually address the problems of the past. And so that's why I think it's important to invent a new name. Because many people, when you tell them, okay, let's do a wealth tax, instinctively they will think, oh, but we've tried that, and it didn't work very well. So for instance, in France, the effective wealth tax rate on billionaires for the French wealth tax was 0.005%. It's a spectacular failure, very big intellectual, political failure, and we don't want to repeat that. And the reason why the wealth taxes of the past didn't work is that they had all sorts of exemptions that the super rich had used to exempt themselves from the wealth tax. And countries didn't try to do anything to curb tax exile. So if one day you said, okay, look, I'm going to move to Switzerland, then immediately you didn't have any tax to pay anymore. Various choices like that were made, whose consequence was that those wealth taxes didn't work. And my work as a researcher has been to try, and this is what we economists can do, that's our job essentially, try to learn from the historical experience, the international experience, to propose something different. And so the idea here is to just establish the principle that there is no right for billionaires to pay 0 or 0.005%. That doesn't exist. Okay, so there has to be something that forces them to pay some incompressible minimum. If you write the law like that, meaning you have something that's focused on the super rich, let's say 100 million or more, meaning everybody who has less than 100 million, 99.995% of the population is not affected. That says, okay, for that tiny slice of the population, you will have to pay this minimum tax. It's much easier to have no exemption Okay, everybody understands that if you have more than 100 million, you have a higher ability to pay taxes. And so there's no justification for introducing any exemption or any loophole in the law. Okay, so it's this type of thinking that makes me believe that we need a new name. It is indeed a new idea, just this principle of having a minimum tax for the super rich. No country has that. We have a minimum tax for multinational companies. It's been a source of inspiration in some ways. In 2021, 130 countries agreed on the principle of having a minimum tax for multinational firms, and now we need to do something like that for the very wealthy.
Vielen Dank, das leuchtet sehr ein.
Thank you very much. Sounds very convincing. Now, before we talk to everybody else, let me ask one more question. You said that your proposal was received very well in France, but not by everybody. So what do you do if they go on?
Angry, it's great. It's a good sign. And it means that they feel concerned. They feel that this tax would be hard to avoid. If they didn't care, I would be really embarrassed. That would be a big problem. Because, of course, from their perspective, they like the status quo. They can pay zero, and we can understand why they want to keep things like that. And this minimum tax with no loophole would really make a difference for them. And so it's true that they have reacted very strongly with all the weapons they have, and in particular in France, the media they control about 80% of the private press, just a handful of billionaires, and they've used it very aggressively to create fears and let people think that somehow it would destroy the French economy. That's really amazing, right? Their wealth is growing 10% a year, and asking them to pay 2%, meaning their wealth would just grow 8% a year, somehow would be destroying the French economy. But they've been making those arguments like in all the media they own, and it's been really disturbing to see, because it's one of the main reasons, and of course it is the main, by far the main reason why this has not been enacted yet. And the Senate voted against, and in the fall, in Parliament, it didn't go through. And look, it's not only me who says that, it's the Financial Times, not exactly a communist outlet that wrote in October that France, more than any other Western European countries, is characterized by the influence that billionaires have on the democratic and the economic life of the nation. And I think they're probably not wrong, that there is this outside influence, but this is really a global problem. Look at what happens in the US, look at what happens everywhere. And so there is going to be this battle, but it's a good fight to have. It's a good battle to have because you have 80%, 90% of the population on the one hand that supports the measure, just a handful of billionaires on the other hand that's very much against. And I personally, I'm a big believer in the power of ideas, the power of democratic forces, not just because I want to be optimistic, but also because this is what history suggests. Those battles were fought in the past, for instance, more than a century ago at the time of the creation of the progressive income tax. The super rich of the time, they also hated the idea of a progressive income tax, which they really see as a threat to civilization. But yet it passed, and by and large, it's a big success, with the one problem that the billionaires don't pay it.
Ja, mit dem kleinen Problem. Vielen Dank.
Yeah, a minor problem. Thank you very much. Now, let's talk about the German situation a bit. Julia Friedrichs, You write books, you make films that deal with the topic of inequality. Your book, Crazy Rich, is a bestseller. Germany is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Where are we in international comparison, and why is that? You say inequality is not really an issue here. Well, yes, but if you look at wealth, we really are one of the most unequal countries. Income and wealth is these are two different things. If you look at income, we're doing okay. If we're looking at wealth, we have the fourth most billionaires in the world. Our billionaires, most of them inherited their wealth. 75% of German billionaires inherited a considerable part of their wealth. Probably, we have to say, because the huge problem in Germany that we don't have exact data. Data, knowledge, that I think is the key to any meaningful debate. Gabriel Zucman said and wrote this as well. We can have a debate if we know what we're talking about. And in Germany, we have no reason to believe that our situation is very different from the countries that you studied. But we don't know because we don't have the data. That's a huge problem. That's a huge deficit. And if having the SPD in government were to be worth anything, it would be really my appeal to everybody. Those who have the data, let us analyze those data so that we can get away from this very emotional debate to a debate on facts and figures, on numbers. Because, I mean, I'm a journalist, a reporter, and I wondered if I am not a policy advisor, I'm a researcher, so I didn't know how can I position myself here on this panel. I mean, I do talk to the billionaires, but in the end, it's a debate on opinions. Some say, but we do pay a lot of tax, and we do contribute a lot, but we need figures to tell them no. I mean, all I can tell them is I have data that suggests that this is not the case, but I can't prove it. I don't have the numbers. And one last thought. We need a precise debate. We need to be precise. We need to define our numbers. I mean, are we talking about net wealth or are we talking about gross wealth? Especially if the left, from the left side, they talk about wealth. They talk about the rich. But who are the rich? So I'm really in favor of a precise cutoff limit. And I like this about your proposal. Then targets 1 and 3, more tax justice and containing the very large fortunes or wealth. But we will not have a formula that will solve all our problems. We cannot have a misleading debate. I mean, this will not solve all our problems. The billionaires can't solve all our problems in the educational system, in childcare, in the military, etc. 17 billion euros per year is a lot. That would be the figure for Germany, but it won't be a game changer. So we need data and we need to be precise in this debate. This is the key for us to make some headway. Because it is an old issue, but we need new facts and figures. Thank you very much, Julia.
Du nimmst schon das Mikrofon, da war jetzt schon so ein kleiner...
Kim, you also picked up the microphone, so the SPD was asked to take action. Tax justice is particularly near and dear to you. I just read one of your Insta posts where you said, unfortunately, I love redistribution, tax justice, bratwurst in the German stadium, and soccer tickets. So we are talking to the right person. So the tax rates in Germany are pretty low based on an international comparison. The SPD always announces that reforms have to be brought about, and with the proposal on the inheritance tax, the SPD got a lot of approval, but also a lot of criticism. Now, let's be honest. If the SPD, as planned, will get the vast majority in the next election, what will happen, or if at least it can join forces with progressive partners, what will be changed? Well, dear Julia, this is not the only thing that the SPD is supposed to do well in the government, because he said that if the SPD has achieved one good thing in this government, it's making data available. Of course, I'm much more ambitious. My goals go much further. But I'd like to answer the question by saying that I have justified hopes that already in this particular government, in this constellation, we will be able to bring about the reforms. And this is why we proposed a reform on the inheritance tax, because we've seen that now there is a higher level of social acceptance. The Constitutional Court submitted another ruling, although we had to bring about amendments twice already without coming up with the right version in the past. But my problem with my party also is that in recent years we have mentioned this in our party manifestos, but we didn't really take it seriously in the field of implementation. And this is where changes have to be brought about, and that is what I'm struggling for. And that is why in the constellation with the union, we have made this proposal with regards to the inheritance tax. Let me briefly explain what it's all about. Because what Gabriel said with the tax for the rich is very inspiring, but especially with regards to the inheritance tax, we have a tremendous lever in order to get this injustice, which was passed on from one generation to the other, better under control. I'm not a communist. I don't think that we should all be given the same. But what's most important is that if you get such a pile of wealth, such a fortune for free from your parents, it should be taxed appropriately. And this is why we've come up with this proposal for the inheritance tax. The aim of which is that we are saying that the vast majority within the population needs to be relieved from the burden. Now, with regard to inheritance taxes, those pay who are slightly above the levels of exemption. These are normally those who are not the close relatives to those persons that they have very particular relationships with. But this is a problem because here the level of exemptions are extremely low. If I'm a grandchild, I might inherit 200,000 euros. That's not so much. Even if I'm a child, 400,000 is not so much. If we look at what's happening at the upper end, that's not really a significant amount. But, you know, there are hardly any possibilities to evade taxes. But when you look at the highest fortunes which are being passed on from one generation, then we introduce mechanisms where taxes have not got to be paid at all. 26 million is the threshold here. And here financial authorities try to find out whether the person who received the gift or the inheritance is capable of paying taxes. And of course, what do all these people do who are very keen on not having to pay on the taxes? They pretend that they're poor. They pretend that they've got no disposable income to pay the income tax or the gift tax. A very famous media person, I'm not going to name him, by the way, because I don't want to get into trouble, but he holds shares in a company worth 1 billion euros for free. And beforehand, he invested all his private property in this corporation. So the tax authority tried to find out, what do you own? Well, I only hold the shares in the company that I received for free. And there you go. This guy doesn't have to pay any taxes. And this is completely fair in comparison to those who go to work every day in our society and pay taxes on their income. Almost 50%. And that exactly is what needs to be changed. That is why we came up with this proposal. And the way in which we calculated it, a level of exemptions to stop at 1 million, which applies to an entire life. And slowly but surely, a very good inheritance tax, which can be paid in installments, should be introduced in order for us to be able to reach a situation which is much fairer. The other Julia over here. Tim made mention of it already. We are waiting for the ruling of the Constitutional Court on inheritance tax, gift tax, and very high wealth tax. At the networks tax justice, we are responsible for inheritance tax, wealth tax, and income tax. In the reform process, you also contributed to the new proposal on the inheritance tax. In addition to what Tim has said, what exactly needs to be changed? And if we manage to change it, do we have to introduce a super tax for the super rich, as proposed by Gabriel? Well, the SPD became aware of a very important point in connection with the inheritance tax. We exclude the biggest corporations because we say that these are corporate taxes and no taxes can be levied on corporations because it doesn't work. That is something that you became aware of, and this is justifiably so, because even if we don't really know how to introduce the right tax rates, there is no indication why corporations should not be taxed. And it's very important to do that. Of course, there are exemptions for people with billions who own shares of billions in companies. And in the future, they need to be subjected to a progressive tax system. That is the only realistic solution, because a reform proposal will be expected from the Constitutional Court. Although I think it's a political question, we don't have to wait for Karlsruhe, because the court is not going to tell us whether we are a society of people who inherit or high-performing workers. But that's quite realistic. But it does not really replace the minimum tax that was suggested by Gabriel for the super rich. Every 30, 40 years, highest fortunes are being passed on from one generation to the other. You know, we impose taxes on wealth all the time, but with regards to an inheritance tax, it takes a while. If we want to bring about redistribution, then you have to say quite simply, well, we don't really die often enough. And then the time periods are simply too long. The super rich live even a bit longer, or maybe they will not die out or become extinct in the future at all anymore. So this is not really a very good long-term strategy. So the wealth tax leads to a concentration of wealth. But it's also a question of tax justice, which does not only affect people who inherited their fortune, but also relates to fortunes for which lower taxes are imposed. And the data is missing for Germany. We don't have any official statistics, but with regards to tax justice, we analyzed individual cases. We looked at the wealth of certain billionaires, looked at their balance sheets, and tried to find out how many taxes they pay. And if things really run smoothly, how much they should have paid. And we compare it to things that happen in other countries. The personal income tax normally tends to be as low as 0, and the only tax that billionaires pay is the corporate tax, but in Germany this will be reduced even further by another 5%. So an inheritance tax won't be the sole solution, no way. But we've got to come up with a combination of both, if possible. Gabriel, over to you. What's your take on that? How can the income tax and the inheritance tax be combined effectively and efficiently with each other if dying earlier is not really the appropriate solution?
I couldn't agree more with what Julia just said. The inheritance tax has a useful role to play, an important role to play in the ideal tax system for meritocratic reasons. But it cannot be a substitute for making the rich pay each and every year. Look, workers have to pay taxes, deducted from their paycheck every month. We all pay taxes every year, and so why should the billionaires be allowed to postpone for 30, 40 years until the time there is some intergenerational wealth transfer? That doesn't work, you know. Martin Luther King famously said, justice delayed is justice denied. And that's true. You know, tax justice is on an annual basis. You know, it's important that each and every year, those who have the highest ability to pay taxes actually pay their taxes, right? And so we can't rely just on the inheritance tax.
Do you need the headphone? I'm going to ask in German. Zu den Argumenten.
On to the arguments that can be used against a higher tax on income and inheritance tax. This is exiting. People leave with gut and tree. If we impose higher taxes on the super rich, they will leave the country, which is detrimental to our economy. And people very often mention that wealth and fortunes are normally kept in the corporations. And therefore, this would endanger the long-term survival of the corporations, and it would also endanger jobs.
So indeed, the main argument against taxation of the rich in the public debate is always, we can't tax them because they're going to leave. And it would be like shooting ourselves in the foot. It's very important to understand that this argument is just not true. It's not true, first of all, on a basic factual level, just because the out-migration of the very wealthy, tax exile, it exists, but it's just not a widespread phenomenon. If you look at all serious academic studies that have studied this issue, the conclusion is always the same. You know, it exists, but it's quantitatively very small. But the most important thing is to understand that this tax exile is not a law of nature, and that governments are not powerless. This is actually a problem that can be addressed. The solution is not terribly complicated, is to say the following. If you've become a billionaire in Germany, and now you decide to move to Switzerland or the Cayman Islands, go for it. Great, do it. Freedom of movement, no problem. But Germany will keep taxing you after you've left. For some years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, we can discuss. The US is more extreme. The US says, okay, if you move outside of the US and you have US citizenship, the US keeps taxing you until you die. Perhaps it's a bit extreme, but what Germany and other countries do is the opposite extreme, which is totally indefensible, is to say, if you've spent all your life in Germany and you've become super rich there and now you move, immediately we stop taxing you. Look, it doesn't make sense. It's not possible. If you've become a billionaire in Germany, that's in large part because you've benefited from infrastructure and education and healthcare and the law courts that have protected your property, and you can't just leave and then have no tax to pay anywhere. That's not possible. And so that's what I propose, is an in-between between the US system, where taxes follow you until you die, and the German or French or the system of all other countries where taxes immediately vanish. I think taxes should keep applying for, let's say, 10 years, and it would dramatically reduce the incentives to move for tax reasons. It would just become neutral. You pay the same, whether you're in Berlin or in the Cayman Islands, same tax bill.
Vielen Dank. Ja. Ich sehe schon erste gehobene Hände im Publikum.
I see people asking for the floor already, but we will have questions from the floor. But I have one question to Julia. The World Economic Forum in Davos, 400 millionaires and billionaires asked to be taxed, for more taxes for the rich. Now, you made a film. The Billionaire Game, The Secret World of the Super Rich. You can watch it online. It's really recommendable. You see, it's a lot of very interesting information. You talk to the super rich in Germany. What are they like? Would they support Gabriel's proposal? Or would they oppose it like the billionaires in France? Well, the good thing is that there's no such thing as the rich, much like the poor. They're not homogeneous groups. These are people. In my conversations, I met people who are very concerned that this society will erode or explode, if you want to put it like that. I mean, we're a democratic country, despite it all, but we can be confident because we're a good country for rich people. People are safe, their property is protected, the children can go to school. And I've met a lot of very rich people who appreciate that. I think the key would be, well, if you want to, I mean, it's a very small group that says tax me now. I think I know all of them personally, so we shouldn't overestimate the size of this group. But I think it's possible to get more super rich on board. A simple solution would be key. And this is why I like Gabrielle's solution so much. A simple solution without loopholes. Because what we see at the moment, I mean, I did a lot of research in the tax optimization industry. The loopholes, and politicians leave these loopholes for others, for people. If this is not illegal. They're using loopholes that politicians have left open for them with the votes of the SPD. They just use them. So there's no use to moralize. What we need is a simple, understandable model that gives the super rich the feeling it applies to all of us, because the super rich are people as well. If you're on a golf course and then there's the tax optimizer and says, why are you paying taxes? It's totally easy. And well, that's the dinner conversation. How do you avoid taxes? Are you going to be the one who says, I love to pay taxes, even though all my super rich friends don't do it? No. You need the political guarantee that it's a simple, clear, and understandable model, which has the advantage that we could dry up this huge industry. I mean, we need skilled workers. All these tax optimizers could be put to very good use in other fields. So my big fear is that politicians like complex and complicated regulations with exceptions, etc., because that is how they can wield their power. Okay, I'll give you a loophole. I give you an exception or exemption. And these very clear-cut solutions, of course, are not attractive to politicians because they want to use their powers to influence and design the law as well. But if you have complicated laws, these benefit the people who have good advisors. And we have a lot of good advisors. Agreement in the audience. Tim, we're going to ask you in a minute, but first, Julia German, in your book Working Class, you write that in the working class, everybody fights for themselves. How do we build alliances? How do we bring about the alliances we need? And is there some momentum? Well, is there some momentum? We see that there's great that the idea of a wealth tax has a great approval rate, but I don't want to. I don't want to overestimate this, because a lot of people say yes, and then the lobbyists come with their myth and their narratives, and that completely erodes your a lot of your approval for a wealth tax. But there are other things that are encouraging. Number one, even though it's unfortunate, I mean, we've had 30 years of very low taxes for the super rich. And I think it's about time to take stock. I believe that a lot of people are unhappy because we have a lot of public deficit. We have a lot of unhappiness in among the population. They're not satisfied with the equality situation here. And the civil society in Germany is organizing itself. We now have the network Tax Justice and 25 other organizations. We came up with an alliance. All the big trade unions, environmental associations, social welfare associations, etc., came together. So not necessarily associations that have dealt with inequality a lot in the past, so environmental organizations as well, but we're all looking at this issue now, and I think there is some momentum. Also, we are quite well protected against tax exile here in Germany. We would have to do more if we were to implement a tax like this, but we do have an exile tax. So you can't just leave the country and be done with everything, because that would be very expensive. So that's one aspect. Thank you very much. Tim, of course, you should react to the questions that were put to you, but also you sounded very positive. You said you'd like to drive this forward even during this electoral terms. How do we get the Conservatives on board? Well, there are some who are actually moving. I think we all heard that Jens Spahn suddenly said that he too thinks that inequality is something bad and is a threat to our society. And that's at least a baby step into the right direction, and we do want to appreciate that. What I saw in the Finance Committee, and I share your analysis, Julia. If we look at those who are active in this field, in policymaking, I mean, I think all the Conservative, all the CDU, CSU members of the Finance Committee are tax lawyers or lawyers or experts in tax advisors or somehow in this profession. And we haven't even talked about trusts. That, of course, is a huge lever to get taxes or to get wealth past taxation. You basically rent your own property. One colleague in the Finance Committee said he's the only one in his parliamentary group who is a tenant. Well, a tenant of his own family trust that owns several palaces. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, you need to be aware of who we are talking to, who we're negotiating with in our own committee. Our concept provides for simple solutions or suggests simple solutions. But if we talk about wealth tax, it has to be the same way. We need clear and transparent rules. Then mobility, exile, tax exile. We have you may have heard Markus Söder, who said you'd have to regionalize inheritance tax, and then we can decide how much we levy. And I discussed this with an entrepreneur, and I said, I think it's quite difficult because I don't want tax dumping and a tax competition, like a race to the bottom where people move to Bavaria. And he said to me, well, they're not going to move with everything only because of taxes. And I thought, that is interesting. We could think about this because they would have to take everything to Bavaria, everything they own. And a lot of people say they just move abroad. There's no empirical data. There's no empirical data that says people move, people just pack up and go, because they have their families, they have their companies, they have their identity that is tied to their home country, possibly. And there's a study from 2011-2012 from the Federal Ministry of Finance, which says Wolfgang Schäuble, CDU, was finance minister. So he's definitely not one of ours in terms of party politics. He says there's no empirical data that taxing company heirs will lead to companies migrating abroad or companies being destroyed. I recently discussed with Ms. Ostermann from the family businesses. I think the arguments have been exchanged, and there's a lot of movement. The people agree with us. They want us to fight for more tax justice. So I think there is momentum to drive this forward.
Das klingt doch gut. Mein letzter
Sounds good. My last question for you, Gabriel, before we ask the participants to ask their questions. Now, we spoke about France and Germany, but let's take a look at the international landscape. International alliances. For the Brazilian G20 presidency, you worked out a proposal for a blueprint for such a super rich tax or high net worth individual tax. At the current moment in time, at the international level, the situation is rather difficult. So how can we make further progress with the alliances?
I think we are at a turning point, actually. And it's possible that in 10, 20 years from now, this period of ours, the years 2024, 25, 26, will be seen as the beginning of an international movement to tax billionaires. And there are a number of reasons why I view things like that. So you mentioned the G20. Indeed, when Brazil had the presidency of the G20 in 2024, they put this proposal for a billionaire tax on the agenda of the G20. The G20 had never before discussed any proposal about tax progressivity, about inequality. They meet all the time to discuss the world's most pressing problems, but in their view, inequality or tax justice was not part of the world's pressing problems. It is probably one of the most important, if not the defining problem of our time. And it was only in 2024 that for the first time they started to talk about that. That was an important development. Then you've had a number of evolutions in several countries that are worth highlighting. In 2024, the UK abolished its non-dom regime, which was its exemption, its tax exemption for foreign wealthy individuals living in the UK. It was actually a conservative government that said, that's enough is enough. You know, that shouldn't work like that. They should have to pay taxes like the rest of the population. Very important development. And the UK is often a little bit ahead of the curve, you know, for good or bad. Whether it was the creation of the welfare state in 1945, the neoliberal turn in 1979, a bit before Reagan, the neo-nationalist turn with Brexit a little bit before Trump. They often have like that a little, one step in advance. Then there was what happened in France that we discussed, the heated debate, but also the massive popular support and mobilization for billionaire taxation. And in 2026, what's going to be really important is what's going to happen in California. So in California, unions are trying to put on the ballot a proposal for a 5% tax on billionaires. And in California, if you get 800,000 signatures, and it's likely that they will get them, you can put a bill up for vote by the population, and if it has 50% or more, it's enacted. Nothing can be done. It cannot be blocked. And there is a good chance that actually in November, California might become the first state to enact a billionaire tax. And that could be a turning point. It could inspire other states in the US, other countries throughout the world. And so I think this is how progress is likely to happen. It's not going to be through a grand international agreement where we all come together and say, let's tax billionaires. It never happens like that. The way it always happens historically is that you have 1, 2, 3 countries that start doing something new, taxing income a century ago, for instance, and then it becomes the thing to do. It becomes the standard, it becomes the norm. And so perhaps California will be the first one to do it, but again, it could be any country. And so I count on you, Germany, help us.
Wenn wir, vielen Dank. Ja, wenn wir dann
Now, when we look at these years, when the turning point took place, we will probably also look back on the time when, thanks to the broad international engagement of civil society and the strong network at the United Nations that was established, the UN Tax Convention can be agreed on. The next negotiations are to be taking place next week, and multinational corporate taxes and the taxation of the super rich will be on the agenda, mind you. Let me look around. Are there any requests for the floor in the audience? Oh my God, so many. Please introduce yourself by telling us who you are, but don't deliver co-presentations, but just ask your questions. We've got colleagues in the room with mobile microphones. Now let's start off with a question over there. I'd like to give the floor to a woman, the one over here. Not as the first speaker, but after that.
Determine the wealth of a person. I mean, how do you make sure there are no loopholes for that, right? I mean, we've heard there's no data in Germany, so how do you do that?
und gerne kurz vorstellen.
Matthias Seeger.
Ich würde sagen, wir sammeln. Okay, hier vorne ist die Dame mit dem weißen.
Over here, the lady with the white jumper.
What about, the billionaires? They're very fluid. They have the money and they can buy passports, for example, with Trump these days. But even before that, it seems like they have options, arbitrage, and maybe they won't move, but they will just say, well, out of my 3 passports, I'm going to use, instead of Colombian, Panama. I think, in fact, in Colombia, they enacted a wealth tax. And they try to be very specific because, they always have these lawyers. And they will just do 1 day less than what they would need to be taxed. What do you do about these international billionaires that have multiple passports? Thank you so much.
Wir nehmen noch eine weitere Frage.
One more question in the back of the room. Please pass on the mic. And please tell us who you are.
I have a question because in your presentation you said the billionaires have had 10% return over the last few decades. So 2% tax would only slow the increase of inequality but would not counter it. So it does not seem very ambitious and would not solve the problem except maybe a few more. What's your take on that?
Das waren jetzt alles Fragen an Gabriel. Ich gebe deshalb erstmal zurück.
Over to you, Gabriel.
Thanks. Great questions. Number one, how do we observe and value wealth? Well, for the super rich, it's actually pretty easy because 95% of their wealth is shares in companies. Sometimes these are companies that are publicly listed on the stock market. In that case, very easy. When these are privately held businesses, we know how to value those businesses. By definition, it's going to be large companies, right? Because the people are very wealthy. And so there's a wide body of work that's already done to value big private companies. We know how to do that. That's what thousands of financial analysts do all the time. You look at how similar companies are valued by the stock market. So you look at things like the ratio of market capitalization to sales, market capitalization to profit, market capitalization to assets, and you apply those valuation multiples to private companies. So I don't want to get too technical, but the important idea is that the government could do it itself, and it could say, look, based on the information that we have, for instance, the income statements of the companies that you own, we think your wealth is 1 billion euros. You own 100% of that company. So, so we estimate that the value of the company is 1 billion euros. You own 100% of it, so your personal wealth is 1 billion euros. And so you need to pay at least 20 million euros in tax. You know, the government should send a pre-populated return to the super rich with that information. So the second question was about multiple nationalities. And again, a very important question. And what's important to understand is that taxation does not depend on nationality. Typically, it depends on residency. Where do you live? Now, of course, you have some billionaires that they spend a bit of time in the British Virgin Islands, and then a little bit in the Cayman Islands, and then in Singapore. So they travel all the time. And so the question becomes, what is your main center of economic interest? And it's well defined in our international agreements. Essentially, it's, you know, what's the most important place for you from an economic perspective? And so that place is the country that has the right to tax you first. And the fact that you might buy, you know, various passports and you might have citizenship from various countries doesn't matter. You know, at the end of the day, you have one main country of residency, your main center of economic interest, and this is the country that has the right to tax you. And then there was a very good question about whether 2% is enough. And let me be very clear that if the goal is to stabilize or let alone reduce wealth concentration, it's not going to be enough at all, for the reason that you highlighted, which is their wealth is growing 10% a year. Average wealth is growing something like 4% a year. So if you want just to stabilize wealth concentration, you need a wealth tax of something like 6%. I'm fully in favor of that. Don't get me wrong. You know, I worked with Bernie Sanders on his tax proposals in the US. He was proposing a tax of up to 8% for those who have more than $10 billion in wealth. I think it makes a lot of sense for the US, for Germany, for France. So fully support that. 2% is not going to be enough to reduce wealth concentration. The 2% minimum tax addresses another problem, which is an important problem, which is the fact that the super rich pay less tax than the rest of the population. You know, this is this violation of our principle of equality before the law. Okay, so these are two separate problems, and they each need their solution. And it turns out that this problem of equality before the law is not very complicated to fix it. You only need a modest 2% wealth tax, but you know, it's already going to be a battle, a complicated and probably, you know, hard-fought battle to achieve that, because deep down it's about expanding a little bit the scope of democracy. The billionaires at the moment, they can live outside of society. They can accumulate wealth without any requirement in terms of paying taxes. And this minimum tax on the super rich, it's about saying, no, you can't do that. You can't just live outside of society. You have to be subject to the common rules. It's already a pretty important thing.
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Ja, nochmal ein Applaus.
Thank you very much. This is your applause. We are nearly at the end of our event, but I would also like to give many other participants the chance to ask the floor. There's one more question over here.
Professor Zuckman, very delighted to see you here today, and thank you for the speech. I'm referring to equality.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Sean Ho. I live here in Berlin. I used to be an economist. Equality should not start with 1 billion or even with 100 million or 50 million. So do not tax-efficient structures, tax planning start with 1 billion or 100 million. Your teacher and colleague, Mr. Piketty, in his book 2013, he was proposing a wealth tax starting something around 5 million, which is in nominal terms equivalent to what the Social Democrats have in mind now in Germany. My question is, what led you actually to confine yourself, your tax base, to the wealthy 1,800 or 2,000? Why not going wider and increase the tax base, which again, in Piketty's terms, applying 2%, would make an incredible contribution in terms of tax revenues. 2% was his estimate on a euro basis. Thank you.
Is the question over? Da ist noch eine Frage da hinten, genau. Bitte vorstellen und
One more question in the back. Thank you very much, Julian Zwicker. I work in the cooperative sector in Berlin. A question to Julia Friedrichs. Thank you very much for your very clear arguments and very convincing arguments. In the documentation, as you made your points as well, you said that you fear that politicians will continue making loopholes because that's what they're there for, giving people loopholes. What's your personal argument? What could we as a society do to counter this or to sort of lobby against this? And there was one more question. I think one last question.
Very much for your progressive idea. My name is Thomas Haudel. I have one question. On the picture behind you, we see a big Luxus ship. And we know that the rich men have a lot of these things. They have yachts, they have airplanes, they have cars. The part on the CO2 is very high from rich men. And that's why I want to know, what is with the private ownerships of these things? Is there included in that tax that you recommended? Thank you.
ja, vielen Dank. Ich würde
Thank you very much. I would say we'll start with you, Julia, and then Gabriel will get the closing remarks. Yeah, first of all, I would love to be surprised by a non-complicated system, but it'd probably be philosophical because we all want to strive for being fair to the individual. That's what they start with. Exemptions have a good justification, and then, yes, well, in this case, we should do it like this, and in that case, we should do it like that. And probably we will all need to live with the fact that simple solutions do not do justice to every individual case, and maybe we're not really good at this. But perhaps we could start encouraging politicians by saying, why don't you just try finding a simple solution here and without individual exemptions, etc. And we promise that we're not going to criticize you for making it so simple because it's here unfair, or it's unfair here or unfair there. Because, of course, if you have simple solutions, there may be injustices in individual cases, which makes it difficult for us to accept. We see the consequence in many areas of life. However, if we want to individualize and customize our regulations to fit every case, we have systems that only experts understand, and we can't even discuss issues because nobody understands it. So I hope this somewhat philosophical take helps. I will just happily take this on board. I would be happy if we could do this. And I'm actually encouraged because all the talks that I've had so far, even after the publication of our inheritance tax concept, I don't really want to talk about wealth tax yet because I think this is medium term that we're talking about. But the talks that we've had in recent weeks make me hopeful that we will be able to come to a significant or to contribute to a significant improvement and not repeat the mistakes of the past that then landed in front of the Federal Constitutional Court. We need a clear reform, and we want to be very clear. And I would like to ask everybody to help us, because it helps us if people talk to us. I mean, we can't just have the medium-sized businesses coming to tell us that they will all die. We also need other voices. So we need to know where, or we need to hear from you. We need to hear where the preferences of society lie. Just briefly, just very, very briefly, what is medium term? You said medium term. What do you mean by that? Well, wealth tax, I don't have the impression that, I mean, if the CDU-CSU agreed to have an inheritance tax, we also have the special reserves, we have the pension systems, and at some point we need to take into account their needs and desires, so probably it will be the next electoral term.
Why not going wider? Und die Frage zu CO2, about carbon.
Yeah, so first of all, on the yachts and the private jets, and look, they would be part of the tax base, absolutely. They're just not a big fraction of the wealth of the super rich. They exist, but it's perhaps 2 to 3% of their wealth, and we know about them, we know how to value them, they're registered, they have insurance value, so there's no technical problem in taxing that. And then on the very important question of, okay, why not start lower in the wealth distribution? Why not a 2% tax above 5 million? Okay, very important. So, and of course, I have no problem with that. I fully support taxing millionaires, 2%, 3%, 5%, no problem. The emphasis on the super rich is for 3 reasons. One, it's because what the studies have shown, the very recent studies of the last 5 years, is that it's for the truly super wealthy, those who have 100 million or more, and especially the billionaires, that the income tax vanishes. And so that as a result, they pay much less than the rest of the population. And that's the problem I was interested in fixing. And people who have like 3 million, 5 million in wealth, look, don't get me wrong, they should pay more tax, but they already pay a significant amount of tax, typically. It's not always true, but typically that's the case. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is that I think it's important to have proposals that highlight very clearly that we are talking about something else than what was done in the past. In the past, wealth taxes started at like 1 million. Here, 100 million, everybody understands. That's something else. So we need to think. And that's important. And number 3, and the most important reason, is that what has changed fundamentally since 2013 is the enormous increase in billionaire wealth and in the power and influence of billionaires in our society. It is actually a new phenomenon. Well, it was there, but it has accelerated and it has become really, dramatic. Just one number. In France, if you look at the 500 wealthiest people in France, they own the equivalent of 10% of French GDP in wealth in 2010. Today, they own the equivalent of 42% of French GDP in wealth. That's the change since the early 2010s. And I think that's the emergency. We need to do something about that.
Also, das ist
Wonderful closing remarks. We need to do something about this. Thank you very much to this excellent panel. I hope you enjoyed this here in the room, and also those of you who joined us online. Thank you very much to all those who participated. Gabrielle will sign a few books, as promised. and you will find refreshments, drinks in the exhibition and also back here in the restaurant section. Thank you very much to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, to our cooperation partners, our interpreters, our technicians, and all of you. Have a safe trip home, but please stay with us for a while and have some refreshments with us.